absolutely nothing amusing about me.
Yeah, you can say that. That's good. Go live with that.
I haven't put up my glasses.
Okay. So tell me about yourself.
Whenever you're ready to show it, just
It's going to go on the middle?
yeah.
Outstanding. Thank you so much.
Ready, press the black screen button and we'll
Thank
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm like 6-year doc student. I need to get done with this shit. You know, anything on the Blackboard? I can't access any of the material or watch any of the past lectures.
I was having trouble pulling up. I think I was trying to pull you up by email and stuff. I'm going to get you by last name. Okay. I'll get it right after class. Sorry.
No, I just want to make sure that I'm watching the videos.
You're in the system, I assume.
Yeah.
So I should, even though you're a resident, we should be able to get you out.
Okay.
I'm sorry? Oh, thank you. Did you shoot me an email with that link? Yeah, sure. Okay, awesome.
Is there anywhere in particular you want me to sit or anything like
Wherever
that?
you'd like.
Okay, so I can go back to the corner and.
Well, it might be. I don't know. I mean, sometimes
It's up to you.
Sometimes TAs have sat up here. Sometimes I've sat in the front row. Sometimes I've sat over. Corey's helping me out with. You'll see him on the mic today.
Okay.
But we'll talk afterwards. Maybe you can be getting some ideas of roles that you can play, where you'd like to sit. For today, just sort of scope it out low-key over there if you want. That's fine. Okay. I saw your setup over there already.
Yeah.
It might feel awkward to be up here. I would never, if I were you. Many of them have.
Okay.
Good morning, everybody. Hey, welcome to another riveting installment of Psych 320 Personality Psychology, the class where we make it our goal to figure out, among others, what makes you tick. Also, of course, you can play this game at home. You can figure out, hopefully, you can apply principles of personality psychology to learn about your strange, possibly crazy roommate. We can help you out with that as well, hopefully. Individual results can and do vary, so you've been warned. Caveat emptor. Now, lots of ground to cover today. Before I launch into anything really official and serious, though, I want to make an important announcement because I am delighted that Corey and I and the rest of our instructional staff are able to welcome aboard our third graduate teaching assistant for the instructional staff, which we desperately need for all kinds of reasons, including the fact that we will have 266, count them, possibly even more, final applied papers at the end of the term, where, remember that paper where you're going to analyze your personality, break it down, take a bunch of personality tests? It would be an understatement to say it is a Herculean grading task, because we will have this huge array of papers, and they all come in at the end of the semester, and we got to get them turned around and graded thoroughly, carefully, with high reliability and validity within about a week and a half or so. So anyway, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce to you the newest addition to our staff. This is Zach Conrad. Did I get it right? This is Zach. Yeah. And Zach was good. Is your mic on? Do you know?
Yes.
Awesome. And he was going to tell you a little bit about himself. The first thing he said is, "Can I just?" No, you say it. You say it. It was funny though. Go ahead.
Now he set it up for a funny statement, and I don't know if I actually had a funny statement. But the grading assignments is new to me. He just told me about that right now. I'm just kidding. I knew that going into it. I'm excited to be being a GTA for this course. I am a doctoral student in educational psychology. I'm on the research, evaluation, measurement, and statistics track. And so I'm heavy in the statistics. I'm way more interested in psychology and personality, though. I'm excited to delve into my own personality as we go throughout this course. There is absolutely nothing interesting about me. And so I am excited to maybe discover something. So if you have any questions, Zach.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I thought that was a good line. It's a tough crowd today. I'm not sure exactly why, but when you told me that there was absolutely nothing funny about you, I laughed. So thank you very much. All right, so we got a video. Remember how at the end I had this really great marshmallow test video lined up for you guys on Thursday? We didn't get a chance to play it. And then I said, well, I'll probably send it out as a link for you to watch over the weekend. I thought, you know what, this is too good not to share communally as a community, and I think it'll possibly give us a little bit of fodder for conversation. So, oh man, don't you love this video staff in the back that's helping us out? Thank you guys so much. Go ahead and feel free to kick it off now. So you will want to pay rapt attention to this. And by the way, I will send out a link just in case you want to see it again, or for the folks who may not have been able to join us today. I guess it's on me to fire it up.
Okay, sit in that chair. All right, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one, so then you'll have two. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? All right. I'm gonna go do something and then I'll come back.
It smells yummy. It smells really good.
So it's up to you. You can have it now or you can wait. Okay? I'll be back. Stay in the chair, okay? Okay. All right, so I'm gonna leave and then I'll come back, okay? So you can either eat it right now or you can wait. Either way, okay? Okay. How'd you do? Did you do good? You did? You wanted to eat it, didn't you? Yeah. So did I tell you I'd give you another one? Okay, now you can have both. You need them.
All right. That was kind of fun, wasn't it? This, of course, by the way, let me just ask, show of hands real quickly. How many of you, before you walked in today, had heard of or seen or read about in some capacity the iconic marshmallow test? Okay, just about everybody. It has become a cultural touchstone, and I think appropriately so. It's a really, really clever experiment. It was originally conceived, as many of you know, as a test of a child's ability to delay gratification. It was developed you to know this. It could show up on the next exam. It was developed by a very famous psychologist. We're going to see him a couple times. In fact, we're going to see him a couple times today. Walt Mischel, M-I-S-C-H-E-L. He, at the time, was at Stanford for much of his career, long, august career. The idea was, as you probably know, to take a bunch of typically 4-year-olds and have an experimenter come in, somebody unknown to the child, and explain to them, first they had to make sure that the children liked marshmallows, with very few exceptions. That turned out not to be a problem. And then the experimenter would, as you saw, say, hey, here's a marshmallow. You can have it. You can eat it now. Do you like marshmallows? Awesome. You can eat it. Or if you can wait until I return, then you can have 2 marshmallows. So if you wait till I return, you can have both of these. I'm going to take one for now. If you don't have one until I get back, you can have them both. Really, really interesting task for a 4-year-old because it's right at the edge of their ability, typically, to self-regulate, to delay gratification. And it was a very cleverly designed experiment because there was a huge amount of variability in the amount of time that kids were willing to wait. And the experimenter eventually returned in probably what felt like an eternity to these kids, 15 minutes. 15 minutes. And some of them could actually go all the way to the 15-minute mark. If you know the play Waiting for Godot, where it's about this guy Godot who's supposed to come and he never comes, it's a kind of a absurdist, Kafkaesque deal. It's probably felt like that to a lot of the kids, but eventually the experimenter returns. Now, interesting thing about this experiment, well, actually, rather than me tell you, what did they find? By the way, as you're pondering that, what did they find and what was this experiment used to predict? Notice that I am giving you a nice example, an iconic example of an experiment, which is a form of behavioral observation, one of our 4 types of data that we use to assess personality. We're going to do an experiment. We're going to set up a situation for study that's very specific and, in some ways even kind of rare. It's rare that you have a chance to see kids with that kind of explicit, controlled task of regulating their behavior, delaying their gratification. What was the point of the study? What did it purport to show? Why is it so damn famous? Why does it command our attention today, even 45 years after it was initially designed? Anybody? Want to weigh in? Allie. Oh, by the way, not only is this Allie, but Allie is modeling some phenomenal behavior that I'm going to try to reward throughout the rest of the class. Allie, can I borrow your name tag just for a second? Thank you. So Allie has her official certified Psych 320 name tag. And I will ask for the rest of the lecture that when you want to contribute in any way, if you want to answer a question, ask a question, make a comment, please raise your name tag. I will try to be really good about only calling on folks that have their name tag. So if you raise your hand and not your name tag and I ignore you, I promise it's nothing personal. I'm just trying to be a good behavioral psychologist, okay? Go ahead, Allie.
Isn't it like a good indicator for later life outcomes?
It actually, surprisingly, and it surprised Mischel himself, turned out to be able to predict some later stuff. Do you remember anything predicted?
Wasn't it like either drug use or how far they got in education, how successful they were with their careers?
Yeah, the career part, I don't know as much. But yeah, the first follow-up that Mischel and his team did, so they originally had these kids come in when they're 4 back in the early 70s, followed up in high school, and contacted them, was able to get their school records and found, yeah, the kids who had been delaying gratification the longest, on average, were doing better in school. On average, were scoring higher on their standardized tests, college placement tests, the SAT, ACT. On average, had fewer behavioral problems. Anybody know any other outcomes that they had? They had less drug use. I guess that kind of could fall into the category of behavioral problems. And then when they followed them up into their 20s, they were more likely, those who delayed gratification the longest, more likely to go to college, more likely to complete college, had better health on some metrics. I mean, really phenomenal for a little 15-minute experiment at age 4, right? Pretty amazing stuff. Did anybody happen to see that there was an attempted replication that was just published earlier this year of that study? First of all, I know this is kind of a big meta level question. I hope you guys look kind of low energy today, so I'm going to ask you to bring your A game. I'm really trying to bring it today. So let's think about this together. Why do we even care about replicating these sort of landmark, iconic findings in psychology? Athena, right here in the front row. Thank you so much. What do you got?
Just to ensure validity, to make sure there weren't things that were missed, and then there's the third variable that could cause things, possibly.
Well, there's a lot. Wow, there's a lot there. Yeah, I mean, I think all those things could possibly be in play. I think there's a more fundamental sort of issue. I'm going to get Emily here because I think I saw your name next. Go ahead.
Can also test the difference between the kids and generation, see if like that or their environment changes it in a way.
Oh, that's interesting. Make sure there's not a, and by the way, in the business we call this a cohort effect or a generational effect. Yeah, that's a possible reason why you may want to see a finding replicated in another generation. It's not the main reason that, by the way, I'm going to give you a little spoiler that may help you. Psychologists right now are obsessed with what we call in the field a replication crisis. Does that help? Yeah, go ahead.
That's exactly what I was going to get at. If it's not replicatable, is it true? Is it what one-time phenomenon that was coached by the people doing this one? It to be reliable.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. So this is what we're finding a lot in the field, and I don't know if you guys are aware of it, but so many. I don't want to discourage you. But a sizable fraction, if you had to put a number on it, this is totally ballparkish, so please, I'm not going to test you on it, don't quote me on it, but somewhere between about 1/3 and 1/2 of the field's landmark studies that you see cited in your textbooks all the time are proving not to replicate. Why? Because very often you'll see one single study coming out of a lab or a research group somewhere, often with a shockingly small sample size by today's standards. So why do we want a big sample? Well, because if you have just a little tiny sample, just a couple of randomly tossed in outliers, a couple of folks that are way off the distribution that happen to be in this little small sample, they can really skew it. It'd be like, the joke if Bill Gates walks into a bar, suddenly the average wealth of everyone in the bar is like $10 million, right? I mean, all it takes is the one outlier sometimes to really throw off your results. So what we're finding is there's this huge crisis of replication. And so what's happened over the past 5 to 10 years as this problem has become more and more on people's radars is, hey, we need to step up our game. And now you're over in social psychology, and I don't want to pick on social psych at all, right? Because that would be wrong on so many different levels, Corey. But it has not escaped some people's attention that many of these unreplicated studies are landing in the realm of social psych. So maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, so basically the top journal, Social Psychology, is the one that has the most replication problems, which means some of the most landmark studies are the ones that are having those problems. So there's a huge push in the field to find replications and see if these studies are real. Having a small sample size essentially means that the people we brought into the lab are not very representative of the larger population as a whole.
They may not be.
Right, and which means that we're making assumptions off of data that isn't necessarily representative of what you'll normally see if I would just randomly assign someone from any state or country.
Yeah, so what, Jason, I want to get your question, then I got an important question. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask if you thought that some of that had to do with the ambition of the people doing the test in order to, to promote and become a doctor, a PhD. Publishing your work is, that's the path to doing it. So do you think ambition is leading to sloppiness in study?
Jason, this is such a packed question. I love this question. Did you guys know that until very, very recently, most of us researchers have been more or less on the honor system in terms of not making shit up, in terms of, you know what I mean? In terms of not fudging data, not fudging our analyses, not, this is total inside baseball, and I apologize right now because this is like way beyond what you would typically think of in a 300 level class. But there's something that we're discovering that researchers have been cheating a lot with, which we call in the business HARKing, which is an acronym. HARK is an acronym for hypothesizing after your results are known. In other words, let's get the data, the results of the experiment, and let's just run a whole bunch of statistical tests, like an absurdly, unethically high number of tests. Here's another insider quote. If you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything. That's pretty good, right? If you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything. If you run enough different kinds of statistical tests on a data set, you'll find something significant, statistically significant, and then you can publish it. Well, if you cheat and you have, as the experimenter, a set of hypotheses that motivate your experiment, motivate your study, and you run the analyses and what you originally thought was going to happen didn't happen, but you found this thing over here that's significant, and then when you write it up, you say, oh, that's what I was really looking for. That's what I was really looking for. Do you see it? So, back to this really insightful question from Jason. The incentives for researchers, career-wise, have always been to get lots and lots of impressive publications, to make really impressive discoveries in science. And so what does that mean? If you are making impressive discoveries, you get published in the highest status journals, you get federal funding, research grants that give you money to do more research. They get you promoted. They get you job offers from even more lucrative places. Do you guys follow? So here's a mantra. Those of you who have taken abnormal psych with me have heard me say it. You know what's coming, right? What's the mantra, one of the mantras from that class? As a heuristic to understand previously baffling, heretofore less than fully understandable phenomena. Do you remember the heuristic? Anybody? Anyone? It's really in play with drug companies, but just sort of more broadly. You remember? Yes, Connor. Thank you so much, Connor. Yes, follow the money. Follow the money. Now, am I so jaded, so cynical? Corey, is this too cynical? Am I so jaded and so cynical to think that a subset, and I don't know how big it is, frankly, nobody knows, a subset of my esteemed colleagues might have been unduly influenced by all the financial and other prestige incentives of publishing really, really landmark stuff that they might have been, I don't mean like making up numbers out of whole cloth, although that has been found out to happen surprisingly not, it's a not zero occurrence. I mean, I don't think it's common. Does that shock you to think that this could be going on? Somebody had their, we're here, did I? Somebody I haven't heard from yet. Yeah. Go ahead.
Isn't this kind of what they're figuring out with like the Stanford prison experiment and stuff like that too? Is that a lot of it was just extremely exaggerated? I mean, besides like the fact that it's extremely unethical, but like.
Can you just very briefly tell folks about the Stanford prison experiment?
Yeah, so the Stanford prison experiment was basically set up to where they had people play the part of prisoners and people play the part of like the correctional officers, and they just kind of like did this full environment that ran for like a few weeks, I think. And it turned out that like basically the people playing the parts got really into it and were being super awful, and it basically set the stage for like how we have ethics in psychology and experiments now. Yeah,
that's good, Maddie. Yeah, it's another iconic experiment, sort of like the Milgram experiment, but this was you guys can write it down. I can imagine it showing up on an exam. The Stanford prison experiment. There's even a film that was released, I think last year, maybe, based on it, that just sort of bought the party line, hook, line, and sinker. It was designed by a showman, psychologist, Phil Zimbardo. And I don't want to badmouth Phil Zimbardo. I'm sure he's made some really important contributions. But he sold it to the public and to his colleagues as, oh, totally, all we did is we just randomly assigned people to either the role of the prison guard or the prisoner, And all of a sudden, just based on the situation, these otherwise normal, upstanding young people suddenly turned into these monsters that were abusing, and they were just horrible. And we had to stop the study early because they were so awful. And so, basically, one of the take-home messages was there's an inner psychopath lurking within, beware. And another was, we're all just captive to our situations. There's no internal moral compass, which I don't know about you, but I think that, A, I think it's bullshit. B, I think there are mountains of evidence to support the claim that that's bullshit. C, what we've now learned in the interim is that the folks who were assigned to be the guards could easily tell that they were supposed to be playing a role. They were acting in a way that they thought, would be rewarded by the experimenters, in a way that they thought would get them credit, yada, yada, yada. So, they were playing a role. And so what do? Well, we have this crisis in replication for all kinds of different reasons, right? For the reason that sometimes researchers care about getting famous more than they care about doing good science. Sometimes they just don't know any better, in terms of the methodology of having big sample sizes. Did you want to weigh in at all? Is this relevant? I know you're a stat guy. In part, a stat methods guy. Am I preaching to the choir here?
Absolutely. But do you want to hit on how to get published and that process of being published and why maybe replications would not get published?
Oh yeah, that's thank you. That's really, really good. Yeah, more inside baseball, but this is kind of cool. I'm sorry, I just geek out on this stuff. You guys, thank you for your patience, but I got to tell. This is going to inform everything else we do this semester. We're laying a foundation. It's kind of like eating your spinach before you get to the filet mignon or the chocolate cheesecake. To your point, it's not sexy to replicate somebody else's work. Nobody cares. I don't mean nobody cares, but the journal editors, the readers, if you're like, oh, this really cool, awesome study with the delay of gratification, well, we're going to go back and replicate it to make sure that it actually holds up. We're going to make sure that there was no funny business, that, because now when you're replicating, by the way, notice that you're really playing by a much stricter set of rules. You can't hypothesize after the results are known. The really cool thing that's happening now? Two things. One, there are journals that have now explicitly said we invite and encourage replications of some of the field's most important studies that nobody's ever bothered to replicate. In other words, before, if you wanted to submit your study to one of the very top tier journals, if it's just a replication, the editor of the journal would say, yeah, nobody cares. And then you'd be publishing in a way, way, way less prestigious journal. Second thing, and I promise I'm going to stop after this. It is now becoming the new standard because of young guys like these two in the up-and-coming generation. I'm part of the problem. I'm not, because I've been a lonely voice crying in the wilderness sometimes for a long time with my generation saying, this is fucked up. We need to up our game. These guys are saying, yeah, we are going to make sure everybody ups their game. How are we going to make sure everybody ups their game? We're going to insist that you have to pre-register your study. You have to go on the record before you even start collecting data and say exactly what you're going to collect, exactly what analyses you're going to run, exactly what counts and what doesn't. Oh, and by the way, after you run the study, you have to upload your raw data so anybody else who wants to can go back behind you with your own data and make sure that you did the analyses correctly. That is upping the bar in a massive way. And because of this next up-and-coming generation, we are going to have so much more robust, reliable knowledge. And again, probably about half to two-thirds of what we currently think is true will hold up. And a third to a half of it will be thrown out. Tim, what do you got?
I just have a question. If the things like the Stanford prison experiment were pretty famous, and so if you tried to replicate it, don't you think people would, the people that were chosen to be the guards would be like, oh, well, last time there's, they're going to try to give a result that everyone is expecting rather than the one that's true?
Yeah, that's a wonderful, wonderful question. Here's the thing that's amazing is the researchers are always able to find people who claim that they have no exposure to these famous experiments. But then you have to ask, is this a representative sample? Maybe these are kind of clueless people that you're running this. So maybe the results that you get with this clueless population that you're running is not generalizable to the whole. The other thing that researchers have been doing that I like better is trying to replicate in other countries where the experiments may not be so famous. And that seems to me a more promising approach. I'm going to let you have the last word or question here because you've been really, let me get you on mic here, Alan.
When you access to raw data, sometimes even studies done by the CDC have eliminated and left one group of population off of the study that would have tilted the whole thing the other way. And so you got to be, if you can get a hold of raw data, read the whole, I've been reading research for about 5 years. And that's the scary thing because everybody is tempted by money.
Well, and money and fame and promotions or, yeah, I mean, these guys, Corey and Zach are probably, I would imagine in a few years, going to be assistant professors at some prestigious university. And now the clock is ticking. They've got 5 years to impress their colleagues enough so that they'll be awarded tenure. And if after 5 years they haven't impressed their colleagues enough, it's like adios. You're done here. So there's a lot of pressure. And what do people do under pressure? What's human nature? They'll take shortcuts and they'll sometimes do worse. Okay, this is great. Are you guys all sufficiently bored now? I know you're out there because I can hear you breathing. I can sort of see. Some of you are still awake. That's awesome. Okay, so let's talk about pros and cons of behavioral observation. Advantage, I mentioned already, can target specific, even rare situations for study, like the iconic Milgram experiment, which we talked about a little bit last time. But I want to make sure you know our good friend Stanley Milgram. Why did I bother to write it up? I actually brought you a little. There we go. You all know it. If you don't, I can send you a link. Well, you may ask yourself, what are the odds that I'm going to be in a situation where somebody who's my boss or some authority figure is going to insist that I do something that I know to be morally wrong, that I know to be unethical, but they're going to take responsibility for it. I'm just following orders. I'm just the cog in the machine. It's not on me. It's on the guy or gal who told me to do this thing. I'm going to administer a potentially lethal shock. I'm going to rip, by the way, I don't mean this as a political commentary. I mean this as a commentary on the human condition. I'm going to rip a 2-year-old away from its mom and throw it in a cage. This happened in our country less than 6 months ago. By some accounts, it may still be happening. You can imagine. Were there people that quit? Yeah. Were there people that said, F this, rather than follow what they regarded to be a clearly unethical order? Yeah, there were some. Was it the majority? No. No, it was not. So the Milgram experiment was, it allowed the investigators to hone in on a rather unusual situation, but one which shed really interesting light on people's personalities in that situation. How obedient would they be to authority? What was their moral compass? What's their internal locus of control? You can imagine how you'd be in that same situation. By the way, not the exact same situation, because then you'd see it coming, but something a little novel, like rip this 2-year-old away from its parents and throw it in that cage. Maybe you think that's okay. Maybe it's just me, but to me, that as a clinical psychologist, as a compassionate human being, that strikes me as not cool, at best. Okay. Other pros, usually regarded as the most objective form of data. Let's unpack that a little bit because I think there's a little bit of confusion about what's objectivity, what's subjectivity. So what do we mean? Just, at its essence, when we talk about something being objective versus subjective. What do we mean by that? As an added bonus, why is objectivity considered a hallmark of actual science? Why is it a virtue? Marcus, what do you got?
You can't really like mess up objectivity. Like it's just the way it is. You're like there's 7 cats over there. Like you can't say there's like 9 cats. There's 7 cats. You know, like subjective is like your opinion, I guess, matters, but objective doesn't. So it's more accurate.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot of really interesting controversy around this point, right? I mean, scientists have always felt that we need to build a reliable base of knowledge on the basis of what's known as objective data, which is to say it doesn't rely on the subjective viewpoint or experience of a single person. It can replicate across people. In other words, you could get a disinterested group of 10 different people together. They could make the same measurement, come up with the same result. Why? Because it is not inherently reliant on anybody's subjective opinion. Now, somebody could come in to that group and say, well, you know, speaking as a person with a phobia of odd numbers, you know, I see 8 cats there and not 7 or not 9, right? I mean, somebody could say, I see 8. But that is objectively refutable, right? We could objectively correct that error. So, by the way, subjective information, we do use it occasionally in personality psychology. That's simply asking the person through the lens of their own lived experience. In other words, viewed from the inside in a way that nobody else can see. Remember? Nobody else has direct access to your thoughts, feelings, perceptions. It's not that subjective experience is not interesting and important. I mean, if it weren't for subjective experience, none of us would care, right? I mean, our subjectivity matters to us a great deal. It should matter. It's how we know we're conscious. It's how we know the lights are on in somebody's home. But we can't find out very much about the universe, the world around us, just through the lens of our own subjectivity. We need intersubjectively verifiable objective facts and measurement. Okay. Anybody want to weigh in on that? Is that pretty self-evident? Yeah. Well, so one form of reliability. This is getting beyond the scope of this class a little bit. Do you guys know what we mean by? And by the way, just for future. Yeah, I'm not going to ask people to just shout stuff out. I'll call on them. But for future reference, reliability just means you get the same answer every time. So if a test is reliable, by the way, can I see a show of hands again? How many of you have taken the Myers-Briggs before? How many of you have taken the Myers-Briggs? A lot of us like it. I mean, it's fun. It's interesting. It's fun. Did you know, and you can put this in your notes, and I don't mean to buy theory, because I'm going to have you all retake the Myers-Briggs and then weigh in on it. But one of the critiques of the Myers-Briggs is it's not terribly reliable. What does that mean? It doesn't give you the same results necessarily every time you take it. What does that mean? Well, the Myers-Briggs is predicated on giving you 4 letters in your profile that designate where you stand on 4 different personality dimensions. One landmark study of the Myers-Briggs found that people who take the test 8 weeks after they took it the first time, they take the test, wait 8 weeks, take it again, 50% of the people who took it got at least 1 different letter. 50% of the people who took it got a different result. That's low reliability. And reliability certainly matters. Okay. So what's the take-home message here? With behavioral observation, we typically regard that as the most objective form of data. Why? Because when you give self-report, remember we looked at self-report last week? Self-report, it's subjective and heavily biased because it's subjective. Informant data, it's subjective. If I ask your best friend to tell me about what you're like, if I ask your mom, if I ask your roommate, if I ask your significant other, it's subjective and therefore often heavily biased. But if we just look at your behavior, and we can even get a bunch of different people to rate your behavior, to measure it, that's not biased. That's objective. Now, there are disadvantages. There are lots of them, but I'm going to make sure you know about 2 of them. One, interpretation of these experiments or these naturalistic observations, whatever we're doing in terms of observing behavior, interpreting it, it's sometimes a lot harder than it seems on the surface. Interpreting it is sometimes harder than it seems on the surface. So what do I mean by that? Well, imagine that you see a little kid, 4-year-old, in the marshmallow test, take the marshmallow and eat it right away. Now, that may be, as the experiment thinks, a sign that that kid cannot delay gratification. But there are other possibilities for interpretation. Imagine yourself in that scenario. What else might be going on if you decided, I'm eating the marshmallow right now? How else might you interpret your behavior, aside from the fact that maybe you can delay gratification just fine, but you chose not to? Why? Why else might you eat the marshmallow? Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Maybe you got up late and you didn't have any breakfast at all before the experiment.
Yeah, maybe you're just ravenously hungry. Yeah, maybe you're really hungry and you just want the like one marshmallow, I'm good. Maybe you have a cap on your daily targeted sugar intake, right? And you're like, yeah, I only want 8 grams of refined sugar per day, and I happen to know, because I carry this around with me, that marshmallow... I mean, hopefully you actually don't know that. I'm just making that up out of whole cloth. But, maybe you don't. Maybe you're trying to limit your refined sugar intake. Maybe what else? Yeah, Allie, what do you got? Are you guys getting this? Let's get Allie on my. I want you to repeat this just to make sure everybody, because this is gold right here.
Maybe in past experiences,
A little louder.
Maybe in past experiences, the person didn't come through. So maybe the kid's mom promised them something and then didn't deliver. So they're like, okay, fine, I'll just eat it now because I might not get it later.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it turns out that there was a replication of this study later where the experimenters did a really cool thing. They randomly assigned half the kids to interact with a stranger adult who made a promise and didn't keep it. And then half the kids, just got some other kind of interaction. And the kids who had a promise by, an experimenter violated were way more likely just to say, hey, I'm taking my one marshmallow right now while the getting's good. You see it? In other words, maybe it's not delayed gratification for some kids. Maybe it's how much do I trust grown-ups who make a promise and maybe are not so likely to deliver on the promise. Yeah, so there are all kinds of other interpretive possibilities. And then finally, ethical problems. Well, we mentioned that it's usually regarded as unethical to spy on people with naturalistic observation, right? To set up hidden cameras under most circumstances. Not cool with that ethically. Also, it's been suggested that some of these iconic experiments are not ethical because of what they put people through. It's been suggested that making somebody think that they're supposed to be giving these shocks to a stranger on the say-so of an experimenter, even though the experimenter says, no, I take complete responsibility, the experiment must continue, it's on me. I mean, some of these people were having nightmares. They did follow-ups with these. Some of these people were having nightmares like weeks and months later. Some of them were pretty shattered. Now, most of them, when they were followed up down the road, said they felt like they grew as a human being as a result of being in the study. Some of them said they felt like it exposed some lack of moral fiber that they wanted to address, that they wanted to become more aware of their own autonomy. So, a lot of good can come out of pain sometimes, but in general, if I'm a reviewer of a study, how would you feel about this, Corey? I mean, if you're on a review committee and somebody proposes a study just similar to that, are you going to let them do that to innocent?
No.
Why not?
I mean, there's definitely the worries of participants after the study, how it affects their lives. People got to wait a little bit more before institutional review boards and committees that review research that would tell you that this is unethical or not.
Are you saying that we can't just go, you and I can't just go design a study and just run it? We have to actually get approval by a review board?
Yes.
We have to actually convince them that what we're doing is not hurting anybody, and that if it does use deception, as they did here, that the scientific interest of what we're going to learn outweighs the harm of deceiving somebody?
Right, and there has to be a thorough debriefing afterward, letting them know that it was all, kind of like a play and not serious. No one was hurt. Everything has to be really detailed in that. I'll be asking a lot of questions.
Yeah, exactly right. Okay, that's enough science for today, boys and girls. Now we're going to move on, and I want to tell you about the last form of personality data. Then we're going to start talking about the trait approach to personality assessment, which I think you're going to find kind of fun. Now, life outcomes is the final form of personality data, and basically what it refers to, just like the name suggests, this is information that's in the public record. So I want you to think about this for a second. If I didn't know anything about you at all, but I had a day or two to comb through the public record, every publicly available source of information, including, by the way, your social media accounts, could I learn some stuff about you? Could you learn some stuff about me based on the public record, based on these life outcomes? Things like, did you go to college or not? Did you graduate or not? Where'd you go? Did you go to grad school or not? Are you married or not? What's your prison record like? Right? Have you been to prison? Have you been arrested and maybe not charged? Will the charges drop? Do you own a car? Do you own a house? What's your social media footprint like? What kinds of stuff have you been posting? If you're on Facebook, and none of you are because you're young and hip, but if you were on Facebook, oh, by the way, Instagram is owned by Facebook, so I guess you technically are on Facebook. Did you know that? Have you guys heard that there's a planned merger of YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook? Yeah, they're going to call it YouTwitface. I know, it's bad. But hey, it's dad humor, and, that's my game. So did you know that there was a study, a landmark study, looking at the things that people liked on Facebook? And as long as the person liked at least 30 different things, the researchers could make really, really good guesses about several different dimensions of their personality. Does that make sense to you? That, like, if you're liking Kierkegaard and chess and I don't know, Mozart, and that you might be in a different personality space than if you're like, I don't want to stereotype, but imagine the opposite of all those things, right? How about this? And again, I'm not trying to stereotype anyone, but do you make probabilistic guesses about what a person is maybe likely to be like if you learn that they are, say, a Bernie Sanders supporter versus a Donald Trump supporter? Could you make some guesses about certain features of their personality? Now, you could be wrong, but you may be right, 8 times out of 10 or 9 times out of 10 about certain dimensions of personality. Does that make sense? Purely on the basis of life outcomes data. All right. Do we need an example for this? Maybe that's not a bad example. What do you think? Need an example or no? Okay. Have you ever known somebody that completely defied the stereotype that you could correctly probabilistically associate with a certain life outcome? In other words, what's an example? How about, do you think there are stereotypes about the personalities of different occupations? I mean, even within medicine, right? I mean, you think about what's the stereotypical personality of a doctor? But within medicine, there are stereotypes about, say, what's a surgeon like, personality-wise, versus, say, a pediatrician or an oncologist. I can tell you, in my family, my wife and I have both been, in sort of the medical realm, healthcare professional fields for decades, and we have a lot of friends who are MDs. And we just laugh hilariously at how often our friends fit the personality profile of someone associated, say, with being a surgeon versus being in case you've never heard this, very often oncologists, these are people who deal with cancer, turn out to be some of the most caring, compassionate, patient people you will ever meet. Now, there are exceptions. By the way, we've got a couple pre-meds over here. I could put you guys on the spot. I won't. Does that match, though, the sort of stereotypes you guys hear? Surgeons, you want to, Rohit, can I put you on the spot? What's the stereotype about a surgeon? Arrogant, kind of not the best. Well, they have a lot of swag, right? Often wrong, never in doubt. Right? Often wrong, never in doubt. Sometimes a little interpersonally callous, poor bedside manner, right? But technically often really, really good, really skilled. By the way, let me ask you a question. God forbid, but if you had brain surgery next week, who would you want cutting on your brain? Someone who's an asshole, who's a really good brain surgeon, or someone who's super, super sweet, but their technical skills, not so great? Wouldn't you take the asshole who really, I would. Somebody had their hand up. Did I say, somebody had their, it was right here. Okay. All right, how about this? What's the stereotype? If you knew somebody's life outcome was they are an accountant, you know nothing else about them, but you know they're an accountant, by God. Could you make any guesses at all about their personality compared to, say, someone who is a full-time actor? What would you guess? What's different about them, likely? What do you got?
I mean, usually an accountant is someone you would imagine would be more quiet and does less on their outside activities, where someone who's an actor is always very flamboyant and they're expressive and things like that.
Did I mention that I was involved in drama in high school and college a little bit? I don't know. Does that make? I mean, yeah. Yes, people who are on stage often tend to at least they have that gear, right? They tend to be a little bit more dramatic. Also, maybe more erratic, maybe more flighty, maybe more accountants, solid, right? Maybe not quite as exciting, right? But what if you knew an accountant who was really dramatic and exciting? Is it possible? Yeah, I know a couple, right? All right, so advantages of life outcomes. Well, often the life outcome itself is kind of intrinsically important personality data. Like what? Well, it might be the thing you're trying to predict to. Like what? Hey, did you get married or not? Did you get divorced or not? Did you graduate from college or not? Are you with me? In other words, life outcome data are often the very sorts of things that we want to predict on the basis of personality profiles. So this is really important information that we care about. Also, of course, and this is what I was just trying to hint at earlier, it can get us in the ballpark probabilistically. Make sure you understand that idea, probabilistic. In other words, we can say with a reasonable sense of likelihood, this is what the person is probably like. We don't know. There might be an exception. And if it is an exception, it can be really misleading. Why? Because it's going to encourage us to engage in stereotyping. Now, stereotyping gets a bad rap for all kinds of, I think, appropriate reasons, right? I mean, stereotyping is simply assuming on the basis of some bit of knowledge about a person that they fit the profile of whatever that thing is. Stereotyping is saying, oh, you're a college professor, you must be blank. Boring? Check. I don't know. Individual results vary on that. Smart? Maybe. Arrogant? Yeah, of course. You could go on from what else? Liberal? Not always. Sometimes. I like to think of being sort of trans-political. But anyway, where was I? Stereotyping in and of itself is not necessarily invalid. It's just invalid when we say, oh, you are X, you must be this, rather than the chances are you're this. Does that make sense? Chances are you're like this, but I'm going to hold any sort of conclusions in abeyance until I get better information. Okay, let's move on. I got a little exercise for you to do. I think you'll find this fun. It's a good time to mix it up just a little bit. I want you to get out a blank sheet of paper. This is just for your own edification. You know what? No. You don't put your name on it. Oh, wait, you have to, don't you? To get credit. Just put your ID on it. Just put your ID on it if you have it. And you can earn 1 point of extra credit for completing this assignment. You got to hand it in. All we're going to do is check to see that you did it. Okay, I just want to give you guys extra credit for being here. This is the first time I've done this semester. But just to incentivize folks for coming, since I don't take attendance. Okay, here's what I want you to do. Across the top of your page, I want you to put these 5 personality traits. These are labels for potential personality traits. How outgoing are you? How sarcastic? How talkative? How anxious? How insightful? Now, it occurs to me that talkative shares a lot of variance with outgoing. Can somebody give me, somebody, including one of our TAs, give me a different, something different rather than outgoing, since we've got talkative? What else do you care about? How about warm? How about warm there? Interpersonally warm for outgoing. You guys with me? So instead of, sorry, I'm messing up your thing already. Instead of outgoing, let's make that warm. And then down the left column, I want you to imagine what your rating would be on these 5 dimensions. Well, let's make it a 0 to 10 scale. Actually, you know what? Let's make it a 0 to 100 scale, and you can give yourself a percentile rating. You know, just like your percentile ratings on your ACT. Like, where do you fall in the population? If you're 99th percentile, it means basically, you know, out of 100 people, you're the top. You can even make yourself the 100th percentile if you want, although technically it's not usually reported that way. 0th percentile means out of 100 people, you are the lowest on that thing. Okay, now rate yourself on these dimensions in 4 situations. Number 1, when you're with your best friend. You're just hanging out with your bestie. Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, when you're visiting a professor in office hours. And try to make it just a generic random professor. Okay, don't make it your most despised professor, your most beloved professor. Just, you know, random professor. 3, when you're at a big party. If it will help you, you can assume at this big party there is a mixture of people that you know and do not know. It's big. And then 4, the scenario that we all love to contemplate. Meet the parents. How many of you have ever gotten to do the meet the parents thing with the parents of your significant other? How many of you have ever gotten to do that? It's epic, isn't it? Have you seen the movie? Have you seen? It's well worth watching, I think. If you like cringe humor, it's your kind of movie. Meet the parents, okay? Take a few minutes to just reflect on that. Rate yourself 0 to 100 on these personality dimensions in these situations as you see it. And maybe, you know, as somebody else might rate you as well. And be sure to put your student ID on that as well. Only if you want credit. I mean, if you want to get it, +1. Okay, if you're still filling it out, feel free to multitask while I move on. Here, I want to start talking now about the trait approach, which, as we saw last week, is one of the 6 major ways in which personality psychologists are going to attempt to understand your personality. Now, first things first, definitionally, what is a trait? Remember, we said your personality is any stable pattern of thoughts, behavior, and feelings. It's a stable pattern, stable across situations and over time. It's what you're like most of the time. Now, a trait is just a stable attribute of personality. In other words, it's a collection. It's a cluster of related thoughts, behaviors, and feelings that we typically will aggregate under a label that is usually an adjective turned into a noun. In other words, an adjective being a word that describes something, and we make it a noun. Like, so if you're impulsive, right, that's an adjective. We can make it a noun, impulsivity. If you're warm, we can make it warmth. If you're agreeable, which is to say you don't like conflict, you want everybody to get along, you want all your interpersonal dealings to be really positive and happy. Agreeableness, hostility, dominance, you get the idea. Now, a nice thing about these trait names by tradition in personality psychology, and this tradition goes back about a century, is they have kind of common sense, everyday kind of resonance. In other words, they feel really intuitively compelling. It's like this is the language that we use more or less in everyday conversation, and it's kind of nice. It feels familiar. Now, notice, though, this next disclaimer, and this trips a lot of people up. In the business of personality psychology, we regard traits as dimensional, where every single person is somewhere on a continuum. They are not categorical. Please make a note to yourself of that. They are not categories. They are dimensions. They're continua. Why is that important? Because you and I, as members of the species Homo sapiens, we, by default, like to think in terms of categories a lot. We see it, by the way. There's a whole big rich literature in cognitive psychology about cognitive development of little kids. When little kids are learning about the world, when they're learning language, they become obsessed with categorization. I don't want to chase down this rabbit hole today, but let's just give an example. So imagine that we're looking at extroversion, which is a fancy term for how outgoing and sociable and warm and energetic a person is. Well, it turns out that your level of extroversion, if we measure it, is going to fall on a continuum from super, super extroverted all the way to super, super not, which we would call introverted. But what people generally do in everyday conversation is they take this distribution. By the way, notice it's a bell curve. What does that mean? Well, if we look at the frequency in the population of any given level of extroversion, we find most people are going to be kind of in the middle. I want to say that again. Most people on any of these personality traits tend to be kind of in the middle. In other words, a little bit introverted, a little bit extroverted. They tend to be sort of toward the midpoint. And yet, here's what we do with our language. We arbitrarily divide the distribution and we say, hey, if you're on this side, then you are a member of the category of extroverts. And if you're on this side, we're going to call you an introvert. Well, that's not very smart from a sort of scientific or precision vantage point. Why? Because a lot of so-called introverts are going to be extremely similar to a lot of extroverts. Imagine you've got two people and you measure them, and somebody is 51st percentile and somebody's 49th percentile, and you say, well, if you're above the median, then we're going to call you an extrovert. If you're below the median, the 50th percentile, then we're going to call you an introvert. These people are almost identical, and yet they have completely different labels. Now, why am I belaboring this point? Because you and I are natural-born categorizers. We like categorical labels. That's how we think intuitively. By the way, now here's the question. Anybody who's taken developmental psych or cognitive psych probably has a good answer for this if you can remember it. Why do people like to think in categories rather than dimensions? What does it do for us when we can think categorically? We say, oh, you're an extrovert, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, go ahead. You've been on fire today. Go ahead.
It's just an idea, but it keeps us safe.
Keeps us safe. I'd have to hear more about that. What do you mean by that?
Like when children start doing it, it's to say, okay, this is that, and this is this, and this is safe, and this isn't, and this is a dog, and this is a house, and so this is alive, and it could be a danger, whereas the house isn't. And it just starts, to me, it's forming a thing of safety.
Safety could certainly be a consideration. How about, if I could broaden that a little bit, it helps us better predict what we're dealing with, right? Like, oh, this is a dog, and here are all the features that I associate with dogness. Now, depending on our experience with dogs, that could be a hazard. For most of us, it's like the most amazing thing in the universe. Well, I don't know for most of us. For most of us dog lovers. Anyway, Natalie, I haven't heard from you yet today. What do you got?
Like developing schemas and things that we use, like stereotyping and kind of retrieving information. It's easier for us to retrieve it if it's categorized.
Could you just repeat that last bit again? That's gold. Just about the information thing.
It's easier to retrieve information if it's categorized in our brain.
Yeah, exactly right. So what does that mean? If I can say in a way that's valid, this is a category that exists. This is a thing that exists, dogness. And on the basis of being able to put an animal in that category of dog, then I can make all kinds of predictions about what it's likely to do, what it's likely to sound like, how dangerous or not it may be. Does that make sense? And we do this relentlessly. You know what it is? I want to make sure you guys get this. Categorizing is a mental shortcut. It reduces cognitive load. Let me ask you something. Do you know what it feels like on the inside subjectively when your cognitive load is too high? In other words, do you ever just, like you're working on a really mentally challenging problem and your head just starts to hurt? You just start to feel kind of like, oh my God, I think my head's going to explode. This is so freaking hard to think this thing through. Some of you may have had that experience in some advanced math class or physics class, but it can happen in all kinds of different contexts. Now, all of us find it uncomfortable when our cognitive load is too high. So we're always looking for mental shortcuts to reduce cognitive load. One of the biggest, most ubiquitous, most widespread shortcuts is to categorize. There's nothing wrong with it except that it's throwing away lots of information. Right? Because every time you categorize, you're doing this. You're saying, instead of the richness of a distribution and dimensional knowledge, it's like, no, there's just two categories. You ever seen, there are two kinds of people in the world, right? Those who categorize and those who don't, I guess. And turns out we're all in the group that categorizes. And yet, if we want to be better scholars, more accurate personality scientists and psychologists, we're not going to categorize. We're going to put people more on a continuum and look at the richness of the information. Why? Because somebody who's in the 51st percentile of extroversion is very different from somebody who's in the 99th. They're going to be really, 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 really different. Okay. The trait approach ignores underlying causes. We've seen this before, right? The trait approach does not care what causes you to be the way you are. It does not care why you're in the 98th percentile of extroversion. It just wants to very accurately measure the fact that you are. Now, let's see if we can get to your little, your fun little exercise on rating your personality. Let me ask, and this is we're going to need to earn our keep here today, Corey, on this one. I'm going to be at the ready. How many of you have a dimension of personality that was pretty stable in your ratings across these wildly different situations? Do you have one that was pretty stable? Adina, what do you got? I'm going to put you on the spot here.
I often get told that I'm very talkative, so like throughout every situation, and I know that I'm very talkative, so throughout all of the 4 situations, talkative ranged very high.
Nice. Yeah, I see that. That's awesome. So talkative in every situation. Anybody have a lot of variability in talkativeness? Anybody have like some situations where you're super talkative and others where you're just not at all? And you got somebody up there, Corey? Yeah, there we go.
For talkability, I went from like 70 to 20, depending on
which one?
Like with my friend, I'm like a 70, but then with like, what was the third example? I didn't write it down.
Yeah, that's good. In fact, we see this with a lot of introverts. A lot of introverts. Notice, by the way, I can't get away from categorical language. Notice I'm using categories even after I just bashed using categories. Why? We can't escape it. It's woven into our brains, probably woven into DNA. Introverts, people that are really low in extroversion, are often super talkative when they're comfortable with just a very small circle, like one-on-one with somebody that they know really, really well. Okay, good. Now, let me ask you a quick question. Which of those dimensions, I'm going to put the whole thing back up for you to look at. Which of them had the highest variability based on situation? Which had the highest variability? What do you think? Which bounced around the most? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say anxious and sarcastic.
Yeah, Vivek, yeah, it's funny because sarcastic was my highest variability as well. What did you have for that?
For sarcastic? Yeah.
When were you more likely to be sarcastic?
I had 99 with my best friend and 1 in office hour.
1 in office hours? We're gonna see if we can bump that number up a little bit this semester. I like that. It looks like yeah, right. Which would actually be a little bit sarcastic. Man, you guys are a tough crowd today. You can see it. I'm working hard up here. Brian, what do you got?
I also said sarcastic was my greatest variability. Up 60 with my best friend and 0 during office hours.
Very nice. Yeah, and I think that's really relatable, right? In other words, there's a lot of variability in how we present ourselves based on the situation, and beautifully enough, that actually makes the last point I wanted to make in lecture today, which is our guy, Walt Mischel. I told you we'd see him twice today. He actually has a critique that was super, super influential, a critique of trait theory, a critique of trait personality psychologists, where he said, you know what? I'm not even sure that traits are real. Why? By the way, this critique is called the situationist critique. It's a good term for you to know. He became, in essence, the first person to call himself a situationist. What's a situationist? He said, it looks to me like the situation drives our behavior, drives our thinking, drives our feelings so profoundly that maybe there's no such thing as traits. Now, what was his evidence? I'll give it to you real quick, and then we'll call it a day. Exhibit A, he said, just like you guys have said, you can find almost any person, and you can find dimensions of their personality, traits, that vary wildly from one situation to another. So he said, the situation accounts for a lot of explanatory power. And secondly, and this is one, it's just a preview of coming attractions. I will explain it next time. It's the only statistic we're going to use, I think, this semester. Have you seen it before? It's often designated with a little lowercase r. Keep your notes out for just a second. I'll put it up here. The correlation coefficient, the strength of association between our observed behavior and our rated traits across situations, it's often really, really small. In fact, Mischel said across a whole bunch of studies, less than 0.2. Now, as we'll see next time, and this is, I promise, it's the only mathy stuff we're going to do this semester, this correlation can range between -1 and +1. The closer it gets to +1, the stronger the association. The closer it gets to 0, the more it's just random and there's no connection. What Mischel said is a lot of times the correlation between people's so-called traits and their actual behavior in situations is like 0. Like what? Do you think you're a generous person? Do you think you're a generous person? We could put you in an experiment to measure your generosity, and a lot of times people self-rated generosity and their actual behavior correlates 0. And we'll talk about that more next time. You guys have a great day. I'm here until 1 o'clock if anybody wants to chat, and then I'm in office hours today from 4 to 5. Bring your paper up if you want to get 1 point extra credit. Just put it right up here on this table.